My name is Hashmat Khan, and I'm the convener of the OFIP Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine public events and our luncheon presentation series, which is monthly. Let me start by just briefly telling you what the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine does. Our mission is to encourage the development of Canadian foreign policy in the Middle East based on recognized Canadian values: democracy, equality, justice, and respect for international law. In this context, OFIP, in the context of Israel-Palestine, OFIP favors any solution that respects these Canadian values that I just spoke of. We know that OFIP members have different views on many issues, and we respect this diversity. And the fact that today's event is dedicated to this specific topic does not diminish the importance of other causes. We're very happy to have Ali Abunimah here with us today. As you may already know, Ali co-founded an independent online news publication called the Electronic Intifada in 2001. It covers the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a Palestinian perspective. Ali is also a writer. He's written 2 books, One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, and The Battle for Justice in Palestine. I highly recommend these 2 books. And Octopus Books has a table outside. Both books are available there. Ali has a deep personal connection to Palestine. His mother was born near Jerusalem, Lifta, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Ali's father grew up near Bethlehem in the town Batir. Ali, as an American citizen, you may be interested in knowing that Canada is in the process of having a national debate on our relation with our Indigenous Canadian citizens. We call it the Truth and Reconciliation process, and it has already discovered some very uncomfortable truths about what our country did to our Indigenous people when the European colonists first came here. So various levels of government have made formal apologies. And in fact, our Prime Minister was in the far north just last week, apologizing to Canada's Inuit people for insensitive and inhumane treatment of the Indigenous people sickened by tuberculosis. Canada has a long way to go, but I'm happy to say that we're making progress. And perhaps somewhat optimistically, it occurred to me that in Israel, Palestine, a truth and reconciliation process perhaps would be a good step toward starting afresh. The title of today's talk is, Now That the Two-State Solution is Dead, What Next? Ali's views are his own and not necessarily those of OFIP. We're not promoting a particular solution, but it does seem very clear to us that after 50 or even 70 years of negotiation about a two-state solution, it seems that it's been fruitless, these negotiations. And here I quote from Ali's book, One Country. Ali writes, in such a hopeless situation, clinging to the prospect of peace through a two-state solution becomes a valuable placebo against a painful reality, even if no serious effort is made to implement it. Ali has an alternative to propose, and OFIP thinks that his views are serious and worth considering. So please welcome Ali Abunimah.
Hello, bonjour, bonsoir. It's very good to be in Ottawa, especially as I have been You won't believe this, I live in Chicago, but I have been following meticulously all the twists and turns of the SNC Lavalin. And so if you have any questions about that, I'd be very happy to take them later on. So obviously, I'm very excited to be in Ottawa and walk past the Chateau Laurier where the famous dinner happened. You didn't think I'd know about all that, did you? But as we say in the United States, always keep an eye on Canada. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful to the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine and to all the individuals who worked hard over a period of months to put this event together. And I really hope that we're going to have a good discussion tonight. And I'm also very happy that that it's been organized to maximize the discussion rather than to maximize me standing here talking at you. So that's really good. So let me just say a few comments about the topic of tonight. And the title, of course, is a loaded question because it already assumes that the two-state solution is dead. But you may not be convinced of that. So it's also my job to try to bring you to the point where I think we are. Now, all my life, as far back as I can remember, well, at least for the past 25 or 30 years, it's been this saying that you hear. You'll hear it from politicians in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East, as if it is just common sense that, well, you have two groups of people fighting, and you know, there's a deep conflict that goes back many decades at least, if not further. And so the obvious and moderate and fair thing to do is to split the country and to give everyone their own state. And that strikes people as extremely logical, if not ideal. Well, it's the best we can do, it's a compromise, and therefore it should be a reasonable solution. And so I think a lot of people repeat that with a great deal of good faith, but without necessarily thinking deeper into what the problem is. I think that actually attempts to partition the historic land of Palestine and to shift people into different territories or states is the problem, not the solution. That is the problem. And so you cannot solve the problem with more of the problem. You have to diagnose the problem before you can begin to have a solution. Now, it's actually helpful to speak about this in the context of Canada, which a new generation understands to be a country that was founded on settler colonialism. And that settler colonialism is not something that is an event, it is a process that is continuous and that takes different forms over time, beginning typically with genocidal violence against indigenous peoples, but continuing with other forms of oppression and violence that may be less visible, but certainly includes concentrating populations in reservations which are deprived of the basic resources for a life, the destruction of indigenous cultures and ways of life and economies, the provision, or rather the denial of services, including health services. You know, on Twitter I follow the Canadian representative in Ramallah, and I think yesterday he tweeted an article saying that Canada is one of the top countries into the healthiest country in the world. That's the headline. Well, that may be true on average, but when you look at the disparities between Indigenous people in Canada and other Canadians, It's exactly the same, statistically, as the difference between Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel in terms of the kinds of disparities in life expectancy and in health. And that's in Canada in the 21st century. We're not talking about the 1940s or 1950s. So those are all ways that settler colonialism continues to exert violence against indigenous people. And Palestine is also an example of settler colonialism. It has its own history, but you see similarities, you see patterns. The first, not the first act, but the first European settlement in Palestine began in the 19th century. And it's important to note that it's European settlement because the Zionist movement was a European movement, originally a Christian Zionist movement. Protestant Christians were Zionists before any Jews were Zionists. So the idea of removing European Jews to Palestine was a Christian idea before it was a Jewish idea. And in fact, until the mid-20th century, certainly into the first decades of the 20th century, Zionism was opposed by the vast majority of Jews. And that's well documented in terms of expressions from Jewish leaders, Jewish communities, rabbis, representatives. They were strongly opposed to Zionism because the basic idea of Zionism is the removal of Jews from their home countries to a faraway place. And of course, the Zionist movement characterized itself in the late 19th century, early 20th century as a colonial movement. They set up colonization societies because at that time, colonialism wasn't a dirty word. Colonialism was on a par with what today would be called humanitarianism, which that's the way people saw it, as we're going to these faraway places to civilize barbaric lands or to make deserts green and to bring civilization and order and all of that. So it wasn't considered a dirty word. And from the very beginning, the Zionists understood that Palestine was a populated land, and therefore to fulfill the Zionist goal of a Jewish entity or a Jewish state necessarily meant the removal of the indigenous population. And that's what happened in 1948 during the Nakba. 800,000 Palestinians of the population of just over 1.2 million were expelled. And Palestine was partitioned in 1948 between what became Israel on about 78% of the territory and the West Bank and Gaza, the remaining 22%. And then in 1967, Israel conquered the remaining 22%, the whole of historic Palestine, which is still the case today, of course. During that period, from 1948 until the present day, there has been a constant process of violent colonization and erasure. There's the famous phrase from Moshe Dayan in the late 1960s, where he said that, you know, Arab villages were replaced, Jewish villages replaced Arab villages. And nobody even knows the name of these Arab villages anymore. Of course we do, but according to Moshe Dayan, we don't. And this erasure has been systematic. Palestinians call the ethnic cleansing of 1948 the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. Whereas, for whatever shortcomings there are in Canada, there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or process, which wouldn't be necessary if people were willing to face the truth. The fact that you have a Truth and Reconciliation process means that lots of people are resistant to the truth. That's why you have to have a process. But you have a process. In Israel, there are laws that punish Nakba commemoration. And the official position of the state is Nakba denial. There was no Nakba. There was no expulsion of the Palestinians. There were no Palestinians. this in the 21st century is the ideology of the Israeli state. Actually, it's a conclusion that Israel has been working, it's a fiction that there were no Palestinians, that Israel has been working for decades to turn into a reality, to erase Palestinians from the land physically, culturally, economically, and so on, and to rewrite the history of Palestine, historic Palestine, from a history which included many peoples and many cultures and many religions to an exclusively Jewish history. And this is what's happening in particular with Jerusalem, where there is a systematic erasure of a systematic attempt to turn Jerusalem into an exclusively Jewish city with a bit of Christian tourism, so that the Canadians and the Americans can come and feel that, you know, they walked in Jesus' footsteps. But essentially to erase the history of Jerusalem and recreate it in a way that suits the Zionist narrative. The basic dilemma of the Israeli state, you know, I think there is a tendency to exceptionalize Israel or exceptionalize Palestine. What I'm trying to encourage us is to see Palestine in the context of other settler colonial projects. So Canada, of course, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland. These are very similar, and there are lots of good books about this topic. They're very similar in the terms of the ideologies, in terms of the narratives that the settlers tell. The settlers always, or often, come up with a narrative that aims to indigenize the settlers, to create a narrative in which their presence is legitimate, or at least somehow mitigates what was done to the indigenous people. So we certainly saw that in the United States, where the settlers are described at school. Children are taught that the settlers were refugees fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and they came to America. How can you not sympathize with religious refugees, right? Everyone loves refugees now. Well, not everyone. But that's who the settlers were. They were the pilgrims, and they were fleeing religious persecution. So they're good people. They just happened to come to this country which had what they came to call savages living there. In Northern Ireland, there is a myth of oppression that the dominant Protestant Unionists who came and maintained their position through British colonial power tell of themselves surviving Catholic oppression, which requires denigrating, which involves a lot of sectarian denigration and rhetoric, but which ultimately is about saying we are the persecuted ones. And in South Africa, the Afrikaners also had a narrative that was in part biblical, where they actually used the rhetoric where originally the Boer republics and then the South African apartheid state was the new Israel, that these were people who had fled persecution, British persecution. So the Dutch and the French descended settlers were fleeing British persecution, and there was British persecution because the Afrikaners, the Boers, were put in concentration camps. This is where the term concentration camps was invented, and they were decimated by the British. So they really were persecuted. But that persecution was then used as a cover or justification or alibi for the subjugation of African people. And so Zionism has come up with a similar narrative. There is no question whatsoever about the persecution that Jews experienced, the genocides that Europeans inflicted on European Jews throughout the 20th century. Zionism attempts to instrumentalize these crimes to justify the creation of an Israeli state, as if this is the inevitable and only answer, as if all the Jewish anti-Zionism that was the dominant trend until the mid-20th century didn't matter. Because, of course, most European Jews up to that point said, our home is Germany, is France, is Holland, is Britain. We're not foreigners in Europe. Zionism is an ideology that says we're foreigners and we don't belong here. So Jews resisted Zionism. So I'm saying that to break the idea, which I think is inculcated constantly by media, that Zionism, a political ideology, is the natural end of Judaism. That's where Judaism ends in Zionism. And Zionism wants you to believe that. But that is not the case. So the basic premise of the Israeli state is that Jews have a right to a state, and that this state has a right to be a Jewish state. And this phrase is uttered constantly, not just by Israeli politicians, but by Justin Trudeau, by American politicians, any number that you might name, by Europeans. And we see this phrase laundering this, saying Israel is the state of the Jewish people, or they use the phrase two states for two peoples. Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and Palestine will be the state of the Palestinians. Except there's a couple of problems with this. Number one is reality. There is no Palestinian state. There is no territory where Palestinians have any meaningful control over their lives. And what does it mean to be a Jewish state? That's the big problem. Well, even within Israel, within the borders of Israel prior to 1967, there are 1.5 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Who are they? They are the survivors of the Nakba and their descendants. In 1948, there were about 150,000. Today, there are 1.5 million. Israel claims, or has always claimed, that, well, you know, we're a Jewish state, but all citizens are equal. You'll hear this all the time. You'll hear Israeli diplomats say, well, you know, it's not fair to compare us to apartheid South Africa. Look, we have Palestinians and they vote. We have 12 Palestinians in the Knesset, and we have Palestinian doctors in our hospitals and so on. I'm just talking about within Israel and its pre-1967 borders. Of course, Palestinians in Israel have been saying all along that this is not a state of its citizens. This is a state that discriminates against us in every conceivable way. In terms of land, we have been pushed off our land, not allowed to build and develop our towns. There are Adala, a legal organization in Israel which defends the rights of the Palestinian community there, has a database online that you can look at of 65 laws that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel because they're not Jewish. And of course, social discrimination and racism is rife. But you also you should believe Palestinians, but you don't have to believe Palestinians alone, because just on Sunday, Benjamin Netanyahu made a statement that really is very helpful in terms of clarifying the situation. And some of you, I can tell, have heard this. But he was responding to a TV star who said Arabs are, Palestinians are, or ought to be equal citizens. And Netanyahu admonished her and said, apparently on Instagram, I'm not following Netanyahu on Instagram, but Netanyahu uploaded, and this is from Haaretz, uploaded a picture of himself against the backdrop of an Israeli flag and wrote, "Dear Rotem, an important correction. Israel is not a state of all its citizens. According to the nation-state law that we passed, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people and them alone. As you wrote, there's no problem with the Arab citizens of Israel. They have the same rights as all of us. And the Likud government has invested in the Arab sector more than any other government." So, I mean, you see this, even the same propaganda point in a statement in which he's saying it's not a state of all its citizens. There's a name for that. When you have a state which implements different laws for different people based on race or ethnicity or similar criteria, it's called apartheid. And apartheid isn't simply me saying, oh, it's like South Africa. Apartheid is defined in international law. And the crime of apartheid is a crime that is among the laws that are in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So this is a recognized crime. And the crime of apartheid is defined, I'm paraphrasing the law, but it's basically defined as inhuman acts, which could include killing, expulsion, forcing people into reservations and so on, or discrimination, a whole host of inhuman acts committed for the purpose of maintaining the dominance of one racial group over another. And that is the very definition of Israeli state policy. And Israeli politicians are open about it. For example, why don't they allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes? They'll tell you, because if Palestinian refugees come home, Israel will lose its Jewish majority. And therefore, they infer Jews would lose their dominance. So, the right of return of refugees, which nobody disputes in any other setting, a natural right. Nobody disputes that Syrian refugees should be able to return to Syria if they choose to, when it's safe to do so. No one says they have to go back against their will. That would be against international law. But nobody can deny them their right to return if they choose to, when it's safe to do so. That was true in the Balkans. It's a fundamental, one of the first clauses of the Dayton Accord, which ended the war in Bosnia. The right of return of refugees to their original homes, regardless of who is ruling that territory. And in fact, more than 500,000 refugees returned to their original homes in Bosnia, a country of about 3.5 million people, with full international support. Only in the case of Israel are we told that the desire of this of the Israeli state to maintain a specific racial or ethnic composition trumps the human rights of refugees. But the most clear expression of this willingness to commit inhuman acts for the purpose of maintaining the dominance of one group over another is the denial of the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes solely and exclusively because they are not Jewish, and for no other reason. Similarly, you see Israel passing the nation-state law, which I mentioned, and I won't go into in detail, but it again is a legal expression of this desire to maintain the dominance of one group over another. I mentioned the database of 65 laws. So those are some of, I would say, the milder expressions of the Israeli policy. And in the Q&A we can get into more of them. But I just want to mention one thing in this context, which is the siege of Gaza. Because Gaza is the most brutal expression of the Israeli policy of maintaining a certain racial composition at any price. Gaza has been called the world's largest open-air prison. It has been called a ghetto. It has been called a concentration camp. And in terms of, and we have to be careful with our terms, of course, because I know that people want to misrepresent what I say. But concentration camp means a place where a population is concentrated of a certain kind and subjected to inhuman conditions. And this is exactly what Gaza is. No one can get in and out of Gaza. I was there once in my life in 2013. I managed to get in through Egypt. This was about 2 months before the military coup in Egypt. Now it would be impossible for me to visit Gaza. I met young people, university students who'd never left Gaza. I met adults who'd never seen Jerusalem. More than 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees. They're not from Gaza. They're from towns and villages that are now inside Israel. And most of their land is empty. There are not Israelis living on it. Something like that. We have good geographic studies of this, that 85% of the land from which the refugees were expelled is today vacant. So they could return. Physically, they could return. They are banned from returning solely and exclusively because they are not Jewish, and subjected to inhuman conditions where the UN has said that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020, which is next year. But anyone who follows the news knows that Gaza is already unlivable. There was an article in the Israeli press just a week or so ago where a study had been done and leaked, an Israeli study, warning that plagues could break out in Gaza because of the collapse of the health care system, epidemic diseases, and thousands of people would gather at the fence seeking treatment in Israel. Now, the gist of the reporting was that Israeli communities living along the fence might catch these diseases. So we have to worry about this. This was literally the reportage. The report in Ynet, which is one of the Israeli news sites, is Israeli communities along the fence will be the first victims. As if the Palestinians didn't exist. They're simply like animals carrying diseases. The Israelis will be the first victims. So Israelis know, or when they want to pay attention, they know what the conditions are in Gaza. But this is calculated. This is what I want to get across. This is calculated. Gaza was walled off, fenced off, turned into a ghetto for reasons which were explained in 2004 by Arnon Sofer, who was the advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, who explained why the Israelis pulled the settlements out of Gaza in 2005 and essentially moved the occupation forces to the edge, turning Gaza into this giant prison. And he explained that in an interview in the Jerusalem Post, I have the full quote in my book, One Country. He says that the decision to seal off and isolate Gaza was in order to protect Israel's Jewish majority, because if not, Palestinians might return. But he looked 10 years down the line. He said, this was 21st of May 2004, but he was looking 10 years ahead, and he said, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will be even bigger animals than they are today, with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. But there's an even more horrifying sentence in Sofer's interview. If we don't kill, we will cease to exist. The only thing that concerns me is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings. Here we are in 2019, just about a year ago on March 30th, there was a mass, we just had in Chicago, Ahmed Abunimah, young Palestinian writer and poet. And in January of last year, he wrote a Facebook post that he said he was taking a walk not far from the fence in Gaza, and he saw birds flying over it, and he thought, how come the birds can just come and go as they please, and people are subjected to these conditions behind fences? So he wrote this post saying, what if we were to come in our tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to the fence to protest peacefully, to demand our right to return, to demand an end to the siege, to show the world that we're human, that Gaza isn't just some black box which they don't need to worry about. And this turned into the Great March of Return. And on the first day, Israel shot dead 14 unarmed people. On May 14th, Israel shot dead 60 unarmed people. So far, more than about 200 unarmed civilians have been killed, more than 25,000 injured, thousands with bullet wounds, explosive bullets. You can read the reportage we've done at the Electronic Intifada and others have done to see the utterly horrifying injuries that Israel is inflicting. In not one single case, and this has been documented by the Independent UN Commission of Inquiry, by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by Al-Mizan, the Palestinian group, by the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, by B'Tselem in Israel, that in no case have any of these people been armed or presented any real threat, any threat whatsoever to Israel. Rather, as Sarah Hussein, one of the UN investigators who authored the recent UN Human Rights Council Independent Commission of Inquiry report stated, Israeli forces have intentionally shot children. They've intentionally shot people with disabilities. They've intentionally shot journalists, knowing them to be children, people with disabilities, and journalists. This horror is not because Palestinians in Gaza threw rocks, or because Israelis felt threatened, or because of any of these micro explanations that people always like to give. It's because this is the price of keeping Israel as a Jewish state. Palestinians want to return to their land. They have the right to return to their land. Israel says you cannot return to your land because you're not Jews, and if you try, we're going to send snipers to kill you. How can you have a two-state solution? You have a problem. The problem is partition and ethnic separation. The solution is to end Israeli apartheid, as South African apartheid was ended, as there is an effort and an ongoing process of reconciliation and justice in Canada, which is a long way from completion. We'll get into this in the Q&A, I'm sure, so I'm not going to say a lot about this now, but of course there's always skepticism. People say, well, how can this be possible? Look how much hatred and how much animosity there is. Well, of course there is. But in which other situation was there not hatred and animosity? The question is, what generates the hatred and animosity, and what reproduces and perpetuates it? In my travels and in my work over the past decade or so, in trying to think about solutions, to think about a way out, I went to Northern Ireland more than once, just to see and just to learn. And now you know, of course, in the context of the Brexit debacle, I was going to say debate, but it's more of a debacle, there's great concern about the future of Ireland, the agreement, the reimposition of a border. When you're there, you don't feel the border now. You can travel and drive between north and south without even really noticing. If you pay attention, you'll know. People can live on either side of the border. They can work on either side of the border. So for practical purposes, it had been all but erased. I spoke to a lot of people in Northern Ireland, or in the north of Ireland. I get corrected too, so I mean, what you call it matters to different people. And there's still deep divisions. A lot of people don't ever mix with members of the other community. Schools are still separate. You find efforts at sort of integration of schools and communities, but they tend to be more sort of nice middle-class people who want to make a go of it. It doesn't necessarily reach throughout the society. You find that some of the areas that were most scarred by violence and brutality and now, you know, the well-to-do have left and moved to nice suburbs, and those who are left behind really feel that they've lost a lot. So what I'm saying is that, you know, I'm not telling you, oh, look at all these utopian situations. These are very challenging situations. But the thing I heard time and again from everyone is, we don't have the violence anymore. And you have a whole generation of children, now adults, who have no memory of that. And that really struck me, because we think that something that has lasted for generations can only take generations to end. And that's true in many ways. We see that. But the simple fact that an entire generation of children don't know the violence that their parents knew was something that people talked about constantly. That was a real gain. And if Palestinian children had that, that would be a transformation in their lives. Leave aside anything else. Leave aside integrated schools and all this kind of thing. That would have to happen at some point, or that would have to be addressed. But the point I want to make is that there are real lessons there. I was in South Africa last year. I'm old enough to remember the anti-apartheid struggle and to feel that that was the struggle of my generation and the solidarity struggle of my generation. Again, you go to South Africa, it's no utopia. There's immense poverty. You see townships that have grown around Cape Town and Johannesburg since the end of apartheid, with people living in just conditions that are really unimaginable. And you see a national debate, particularly young people who are impatient and who say, well, we're still poor, we're still not getting the jobs, we're still not getting water and electricity. And you see an older generation saying, well, you should have seen what life was like for us. So these aren't utopias, but you still have a country that is in command of its own fate, and a people that was liberated, and that doesn't underestimate the price of that struggle or the opportunity that it gives for a better future. So that's to say that I think, I believe, I argue that such a transformation is possible in Palestine. What it would look like might be very different. But we have a situation where within historic Palestine today, the population is 50-50. When you account for the refugees who aren't allowed to return, it's 2/3 Palestinian. Any way you cut it, Jews are going to be a minority. Whether it's a 49% minority or a 30% minority, they're going to be a minority. What ties Israel-Palestine with Northern Ireland and South Africa and what makes it different from Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand is that in Ireland, Palestine, and South Africa, you had settler colonialism like the other places I mentioned. But as to quote the Israeli historian Benny Morris, they didn't finish the job. I mean, I hate to use that language because it erases the fact that indigenous people did survive in Canada and North America and in New Zealand and Australia. But the scale of the genocide, the numbers mean that as a percentage of the population, indigenous communities do not represent what the settlers or the settler society views as a threat to its existence. In Ireland, Palestine, and South Africa, there were enough natives left. In South Africa, there were a majority. In the north of Ireland, they're about 45%, and in Palestine, currently 50%. And in those situations, the only solution in the end, after everything else was tried, was a single political entity. And so the logic on the ground and the historical precedents are not for two-state solutions. Therefore, recognizing the settler colonial nature, adopting a constitutional arrangement that gives everyone equal rights, and then embarking on a process of addressing the material consequences of that settler colonialism. In South Africa, land reform is the major challenge that has not been completed or even really started. In Ireland, it is employment and economic discrimination, among many others, but one of the main things I heard about. In Palestine, it would be all of the above. It would be land, housing, education, economics, health, and so on. But really, when it comes down to it, what alternative is there? Thanks.